Hello everyone, my name is Philip. I'll be the chair of this round. Congratulations to both teams once again to making it into the Octo finals. With me judging are Nika and Benedict. They can say hi as well.
Hi.
Hi there.
All right. Um, so the motion for this round is this house believes that votes cast by youths should have more weightage in national elections. On side proposition, we have Team USA Blue. On side opposition, we have Team WSDC Vietnam. If all speakers are ready, I would welcome the first speaker of side proposition to start the debate. Here.
Thank you. And I prefer just visual POIs, if that is okay. For too long, democratic systems all over the world have been dominated by older individuals who refuse to listen to calls for social change that the youth are advocating for. For too long, the youth have been shut out of politics, locked out of representation, and legislation that will affect them 30 years down the line. It is time that changed. Proud to propose the motion. This House believes that votes cast by youth should have more weightage in national elections. In this speech, I'm going to be presenting the proposition framework and two proposition substantives. The third will be presented by my partner in their next speech. First, what does this weightage actually look like? We think youth depends on individuals in the country's lifespan, but generally it's considered ages 18 to 30 years old. The weightage of votes that would be cast with the youth would be valued at a ratio of 1.5 compared to the value of 1 for other people in the society's votes. Note that we're uniquely talking about national elections, not local, regional, or provincial ones. 4 important distinctions between the two that characterize why it's uniquely local and national elections. First, local, regional, and provincial elections uniquely focus on short-term issues, for example, city ordinances, road repairs, local transportation, whereas national policy quite literally dictates the view of the country and the trajectory in which it will follow. Second, we think they're generally shorter election terms in general, whereas you vote less on national policies than you do for a large amount of elections that exist within your local areas. Elections happen far more often, and this means that those legislators have far less power to make and carry out substantial long-term change from those in the national government. Third, though, we think there are dramatically less people that vote in local provincial elections. As a percentage, local elections only get a fraction of the participation national elections do. Fourth, local elections have less power to create the broad change we're talking about, whereas they can establish things for their direct communities, but not things that will impact the entire country. And indeed, because these policies are so expansive, the entire world by extension. With that, 2 substantives to forward the proposition. The first is the principle of representation. Note that policies determined in national elections and politicians themselves do make those sweeping claims that policies literally dictate the trajectory of the entire country. Elected leaders on national levels literally run on their vision of the country and then link it to specific implementations, not the other way around. 2 mechanisms then as to why we create a better form of representation on our side of the house. First, we believe that people that live longer are experiencing the policies most long-term and thus should have more of a say in their implementation and indeed what policies are elected. National elections, which are specified in the motion, concern long-term national scale policies. Every time a new policy is implemented, it sets an important precedent and shifts public perception, influencing future policies as a whole. Individuals only get a say in long-term structural problems like climate change on national elections, making them uniquely important. This is true because to tackle these problems, federal policy needs to be implemented, and these problems are often when local elections cannot solve because of the sheer lack of influence that those specific leaders have on the country as a whole. Youth are significantly more likely to be impacted by these policies as far as they will simply live longer and experience the repercussions for a far longer extent than older constituencies. For climate change, older individuals will likely not care because it doesn't concern them in 30 years if the earth is burning because they'll be dead by then. Even if they have some concern for their children or the health of the world, they're far more likely to choose things like a tax cut that will benefit them now, as they're more likely concerned with the short-term impacts that are going to far greatly affect their lives. People are not long-termist in nature. It's only when their lives are directly a threat or when they can see a direct impact to them later in their lives, they will actually act upon it. One group should not be able to dictate the livelihoods of another group in the long term. We think largely this is the status quo. And we often support more representation for issues that have significance to a particular group. For example, in a council on how to better implement policing, there would be less racists in the world. We do think minorities should have a greater representation within that discussion because we think they are most impacted, their lives are most at stake by any policies that exist there. In this case, because long-term policies affect the youth, they should have a greater vote. The second reason, though, why we think this is principally justified and indeed principally important is because they're structurally set out of policies. Youth make policies that are in control of the party leaders, and media leaders are often the establishment, often ignored entirely. Before I move on, I'll take your point.
National elections also determine very short-term immediate policies that affect elderly individuals like retirement ages and elderly assistance. Why is this okay given this impacts elderly individuals right now?
Two responses. First, broadly, the discussion is on those long-term policies, as most of these short-term policies can be implemented on a case-by-case basis in local regions. Secondly, though, the progressive policies that we think the youth are very likely to support often do include things like Medicare. That is generally something that people view as incredibly important, a policy that would directly affect the elderly in the first place. Note, why though is this explicitly distinct from policies that disenfranchise specific groups? It is because in our world, every voter in society would have at some point in their lives their vote counting more. In our world, everyone sees the benefit equally, just at different times. The people that lose this advantage now are now living with the effects of the policies that were put in place while they were the youth themselves. I mean, the status quo is very repressive to the youth in the first place, especially given the policies will affect them the most. We think this policy is principally important. The second substantive, though, that I'll forward in this speech is that we achieve actually better policies as a whole on our side of the house when you have youth as a bigger voting demographic, a bigger group of people to preach to. The status quo largely underrepresents the youth in both elections themselves and the legislation that those elected officials end up creating once they're in office. What do we change in our world? First, we get broadly more progressive policy overall, and candidates that are going to support broadly progressive policy, as now those candidates have to focus on the youth as a larger demographic than they do in the status quo. Largely in the status quo, they're able to dismiss the youth votes entirely, first because the youth are likely to vote less, and second because they're able to disenfranchise them through both telling them not to vote and making it very hard to access voting in the first place. We think largely this is why they rely on old people as their general voting demographic. Why, though, do we think this progressive policy is more likely to happen? Society is progressively becoming more opening and accepting as a whole, generally more in support of people of accepting policies. The youth are at the forefront of this progressive push, and note they kind of always have been. The biggest movements throughout history are often led by youth in the first place. This looks like the anti-apartheid movement, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. We think people are very at the forefront of this. Now, we aren't saying here that older individuals are inherently racist or sexist. However, progressive ideas are largely held by younger individuals who created those opinions based on a new society forming and generations that value different things like social equity and far more. I mean, they're more likely that old people are going to stay within the views that were created when they were youth and are thus going to keep those views even as society progressive. We think young people are far more likely to change their opinions, make the society more representative of them. But what is the biggest impact here? Is it issues like climate change that are quite literally creating the doom of society in the status quo need immediate address. We cannot wait for 30 years down the line while everyone living will be affected. We need the policies that are implemented now. Given that the youth will experience these policies at a far greater rate, their lives are literally in danger and will be for the rest of their lives. We think they deserve the most say. They will push the policies that will literally save the world. So proud to propose.
We thank the first speaker for her speech and welcome the first speaker of side opposition. Here.
Am I audible? Panel, democracy does not work in proposition the moment where you throw a certain group of people under the bus just because of the time that they have left on this earth or just because of the ideologies they held. Because of these reasons, I'm very proud to oppose. I'm going to first tackle proposition's main case and then go on to my first argument about how we deliver democracy and fairness. Why is it the most important thing in this debate? And secondly, how do we think we decrease political apathy on our side of the house? So first, on their idea of representation, I think this is factually untrue. The fact that youth are completely disengaged with the political system. This is because in the recent US election, we see a rising number, an exorbitant amount of people, youthful people going to vote. And then the whole Instagram campaign, as well as social media campaigns that encourage people to go vote actually work. But the second thing, which is more important, is that I think generally they have a problem solution mismatch, because if the problem they identify is that youth are structurally left out of the system, that means that the system needs to be changed, not about the voting system and the voting policies that need to be changed. To which this often means that even if you empower more people, more youthful people to vote, if politicians do not care about this inherently, this means that their benefits can never actualize. The comparative, however, on our side of the house is that in the status quo, there are already a lot of measures to ensure that voters are actually have more accessibility to voting places, something that can be done in Korea or even off days from work during election days in Japan. This argument will also be engaged further with my argument as well. The second thing they talk about is this idea of better policies, about how youth care more about progressive policies. Not only do we think this contradicts with their oath, their 3 minutes of democracy, is that you can't throw away a person's vote just because of the ideologies that they hold. But secondly, we also tell you that at worst the benefits are at best a wash, because we think the fact that the elderly still care about their future generations often mean that they still vote for these progressive policies anyways. This means that their policy, whatever they propose, is quite unnecessary. With that, my first argument will be about how it's principally unjust to do this in terms of democracy and fairness. The first subpoint under this is that we think a one person, one vote is a foundation of a stable and responsible government. The first reason why is that we think the state has a reciprocal responsible obligation for everyone. This means that the moment where you pay tax, or even more, when the elderly have lived for literally 60 years in their lives, they work, they contribute to the economy, they even hold powerful businesses, which means that they contribute a lot to the government. This often means that it's very appalling and condescending to claim that a person is no longer worth being cared for because their time on earth is shorter, to strip away their rights even when they still contribute a part to this to the economy. The second thing is how we talk about how the policies affect everyone. This means that the fact that the elderly still are a part of the system in which these policies that are proposed still benefit them in the short run. Even if it's in the short run, we think they still have the obligation to have their voice heard in determining their future as well. But the third thing why we think it's also important to do so is that I think it's very important for a democracy system to ensure representation for all. This means that leaving elderly out on issues about their pensions to focus on maybe not guaranteed progressive policies like reform the criminal justice system is as bad as passing discriminatory policies without weighting the youth votes in the first place. This also directly engages with their point about progressive policy. But lastly, I think the reason why democracy is really important, no thank you, is that we think the moment when voters have certain rights that they are protected, this means that they have more trust in the system that the government can care for them. This means that they are more likely to obey and to cooperate. Therefore, that is the reason why you get passing the policies on our house. The second subpoint under democracy is that we think the elderly require fair representation. To be very clear, the elderly are among the very vulnerable groups in society. They obviously first require physical assistance, which often needs to be subsidized by the state, but second, they often depend on pension funds or retirement plans for their own subsistence. The fact that nursery homes a dwindling inequality, we have less support for these people, often means that it's often a really urgent time to do this. These are all the same involved programs that can and will be gutted by a government elected by the youth. We would say that the youth are more likely to fund programs that directly benefit them, like complete college debt wipes or discounted housing for young families. The significance of this observation is not simply that this makes life considerably miserable for an elderly who have contributed much to the state, but rather this creates a political cycle in which elderly are abandoned. This means that when you cut healthcare costs, the worst impact on the round that you get on proposition is death. This means that if you cut pensions and housing, people will be homeless. And the even worse thing about this panel is that these people cannot re-enter the workforce again. The fact that they are very dependent on the government to recreate the future for them means that the only way to do this is through votes, where the youth can still work and make substantial changes to their lives. Given that the youth today will also be the elderly of tomorrow, in the long run, we think they perpetuate a cycle of neglect. This will have irreversible impacts. My second argument is going to about how we lead to political apathy. The first reason why we think this leads to a negligence of elderly is that we think politicians will considerably switch their policies in order to be more appealing to their youth, like cutting on retirement funds because they now have a majority of the votes. But secondly, I think elderly issues will lose media coverage because it holds less weight in elections. But lastly, I think the zero sum of resources means that more resources to youth issues like climate change would significantly decrease resources for elderly issues. The impact of this is that once you lose participation from older voters, you have greater polarization as well as less support as possible towards the youth agenda. And when it comes to policies that require collective action, such as supporting social movements about climate change that P1 really wants to talk about, we think we need to have these elderly people in line, like how they need to be in line with these kind of policies to use public transport to cut down on plastic. We think this often means that their impacts are contingent from having ours first. But lastly then, why do we think they don't get solvency on their house? Because I think most of their benefits rely on assumption that youth will always vote for progressive policies and the age don't care about these policies. The first reason why is that we think as they characterize like really correctly, people are generally short-termists, even politics is. This often means that youth are more likely to care about imminent things in their lives. This means that they have certain priorities already set in their minds, that it means that that proposition's benefits are not 100% likely sure that they will actualize. This looks like how a poor college kid does not just in the middle of a college debt, does not just think about how look for ways to make the earth more green, but more importantly, they focus on the imminent impact of how student college debts has on his life. The comparative is panel, we at least have some kind of benefits on our house. The moment where counterfactual is a world in which we have not a world in which we have absolutely no change because the elderly still have grandchildren. They still care about the future of their loved ones. For all of these reasons, because we tell you that it's completely unjust for them to just ditch a group out of the table, but second of all, how they decrease effectiveness on their side of the house, very proud to oppose.
I thank the first speaker of side opposition and welcome the second speaker of side proposition to take the floor. Here.
Can everybody hear me? Okay. I think the biggest problem coming from side opposition is that at the top of their speech, they tell us that there's a problem solution mismatch, and then fail to provide a solution of their own on their side of the house, other than to just say, Japan, reform the system. Note that on either side of the house, we're trying to reform the system, but we're trying to find the best way and the most democratic way in which we can shift the Overton window a certain way to support more progressive policies like climate change, which they agree is an issue. Insofar as they don't provide you with any counterfactual that is explained with any examples or illustration of these type of restrictions or reforms that they would like to put in like Japan, we don't think they can win the debate. Insofar as they also realize there's a huge issue in the political arena and sphere today that does not address crucial problems such as climate change, such as racial justice, etc. In my speech, I want to do a couple of things. Firstly, I want to make some clarifications about our stance and what our burden on side proposition is. Secondly, go on to the two clashes on principle and better policy change on side proposition, and then provide you our third substantive argument on why we actually encourage more political activism as well as participation from the youth, which is good for policy change in the long term. So firstly, note that we don't have to defend that every single youth is likely going to vote a certain way. We're looking at the shared characteristics that youths have. Firstly, the political climate is in fact shifting. Cam brought you many examples about how some of the most successful societal movements have been spearheaded by the youth because they have a different perception of the world. But secondly, the sheer fact that they're inevitably going to live longer than old individuals, which dramatically changes their decision-making calculus, which is the thesis of our principle. So given that, I think on side opposition, other than to make their entire case about old individuals, they don't engage with any of the substantive material we give you on how we actually help old individuals on our side of the house and how we're able to principally justify this through our mechanism of longevity on the principle. So now let's go on into this specific clash. I would like to make something very clear. We're not discriminating against old individuals for two reasons. Firstly, note that old individuals still have a say in these political issues. We're not saying that somebody is entirely wiped out of the political arena. So there's still reasonable reason to believe that politicians will still care about them to an extent and have policies that pertain to the old individuals as they're still a sizable chunk of society. But secondly, we think that they never engage with our principal justification of why youth votes should be weighed more. We told you about the uniqueness of national elections. We told you in the majority of cases, the presidency and the Congress decide long-term policies based on climate change as well as tax plans that take a long time to overturn as well as implement. And the process is quite arduous because as the policy changes, it impacts precedent, it impacts the political climate, polarization, which deeply impacts as well as the political arena in general, the next 10, 20 years pertaining to specific policies. So we think in this situation, comparatively, national elections specifically mentioned by the motions are far more likely to concern things like climate change and such, even if we were to accept that old individuals do have like policy stakes, such as in retirement, etc. I just think the scale of the policies that we're talking about are far larger, which is the justification of why youth should have this stake and this extra stake for the pure reason that they're going to be the ones impacted for the long term. They're going to be the ones who should have control of what their future looks like. And we don't think that a select group of older individuals who care about their immediate benefits should be able to literally cull off the next 30 years and the next generations because they weren't able to act fast enough for climate change and such. Before I go on, I'll take a point.
If on your side of the house, elderly individuals still have some amount of political capital and they're uncooperative with social justice, as you say, or climate change, why do you get any type of tangible change?
Look, I'm going to address this old person argument in 1 second. So let's just go on to the next clash about better political climate, as we get very little engagement on the principle we actually give you in the first speech about longevity. The only thing that they really say in response is one man, one vote, and that's a really good thing. Can everybody hear me? Yes, okay. Now I'm going to go on to the second clash on better political climate. And I'll address this old people problem very head on. So firstly, note that on their side of the house, there's no reason to believe why old people have representation. Old individuals aren't active in the political arena right now. They're not the ones that are going out voting. If they want to advocate for the sickly old individuals who need Medicare and Medicaid desperately because they're dying of cancer, I really doubt these were the individuals that politicians were going to pander to in the first place because they're unlikely to vote. Their life is almost going to end. People don't represent their interests, etc. So those are the individuals who are still systematically shut out on their side of the house. On our side of the house, why do we actually help old individuals? This is because once we gain traction for leftist campaigns, most of the time, climate change and Medicaid, Medicare, social services are all in accordance with one political ideology, and they're likely to exist at the same time. And politicians are likely to also run on the platform in the situation to advocate for both climate change and Medicaid, Medicare. I'm unsure of how they eat into each other. So on our side of the house, if we're able to get broader support for more progressive policies, this necessarily includes older individuals because of things like retirement, because of things like benefits, all fall under the ideas of the more progressive policies that they're going to vote for in the first place. So these individuals are actually better taken care of on our side of the house if we're able to get wide-scale political traction for things like climate change, for things like racial justice, because they tend to align themselves and group themselves with each other. This means more vote and more power for the parties that represent the individuals and marginalized groups that the youth are caring about, as we've characterized to you. you. So I think on our side of the house, we're just far more likely to gain traction that genuinely helps the elderly. And on their side of the house, because they don't tell us what's going to change, they don't give us any specific plan or policy for how old elderly are going to get more representation. They actually don't solve the problem at all. Note in the LO speech, they just keep talking about how elderly are shut out. They're not represented. They don't solve that problem on their side of the house either. These sickly individuals don't have money. They're unable to pander. They're unable to lobby. Nobody represents them. On our side of the house, if we get support for the broader ideas of societal welfare, we're far more likely to get progressive policy that helps the only stakeholder, by the way, that side opposition cares to bring up. But now let's go on to the importance of our case. I think climate change is a big issue that they vastly undercut. Even if you take our case at the very, very worst and say, sure, old people are screwed over, a smaller group won't get unemployment benefits, etc. What we crucially get on our side of the house is that we're able to act fast for things like climate change and things like racial justice that are hurting a large amount of people right now, every single day. And climate change, if not acted upon in 10 years, is going to literally kill like in the entire human race, which I think is quite an incentive, right? Note that comparatively, we're not saying that youth will always vote for climate change or always vote a certain way, but they're far more likely to in comparison to older individuals who see their life ending before climate change is actually going to come into fruition. And they're likely to be also the same people who are susceptible to rhetoric of Donald Trump that climate change perhaps isn't even real. So on our side of the house, we're far more likely to tackle the issue because youth as a collective, as we've characterized, this characterization has also been uncontested. They're more likely to believe in these things, they're more likely to vote. And this leads to my extension on why it disincentivizes the youth to actually run for things like parliament as well as presidency. Because right now, the youth feel very alienated from the political world. Every single person that they see representing them is the old white man who seems to be very privileged. However, right now, there is a wave with AOC and Pete Buttigieg and younger candidates in office. And we think on our side of the house, if they know that they will get support from the youth, if they know that there is a chance at winning because the youth are now a major stakeholder, this means that they're more likely to participate in the political process as a whole, which inevitably means also more youth representation on our side of the house, which is good for all of the reasons we brought to you earlier about progressive policy. I think it's quite reasonable to say that climate change is important, racial justice is objectively something.
All right, I thank the second speaker of side proposition and welcome the second speaker of side opposition. Here.
Sorry, am I audible? Am I audible? Thank you. My timer start in 3, 2. Panel, before moving on, let me make some corrections on the burden of both teams and how side proposition is trying to put unfair burden on our side of the house. So two things that they talk about. The first thing is about the progressive ideas and everything. We think that we as side opposition don't have to prove to them that our side as the elderly, as a more conservative idea is more important than the progressive idea. Outside of the house will simply win if we prove to you that conservative idea is as important as progressive idea. And we think that it's how things are being balanced out, it's how the society is being controlled, and it's how the well-being and the benefit of everyone is being fulfilled. We think that if outside of the house can prove that the conservative idea coming, even if it coming more from the elderly, and the progressive idea of the youth can coexist, and we think that we win this debate. Well, outside side of proposition only prove to you that one side of proposition have to prove to you that climate change, the only one specific problem that they talk about in this debate, is the most important and more important than everything else in this debate. But secondly, the second burden is on how say and I'll say that how they help the elderly, right? And how the whole thing of and how the whole thing of one vote and the principle of the principle of the democracy is being neglected in this side of the house. Now, the only line of logic that they provide us on outside of the house on our principle is that they say, oh, these people, these elderly people, they still have a say, right? Even if the voice of the younger people is more important, and still, if the elderly people still have a say, then it's okay. We think that this is not okay, right? We think that this is compatible to how they treat the people of color in the past. They just simply say that, oh, you still have somewhat a voice, even if it's half a voice, it still works. We think that this is not how the democracy works. We think that it's unfair and it's intrinsically going against the principle of democracy. We think that they are talking on the lower morally route and they are failed on this principle route. But moving on, we think that when they talk about the elderly still have some certain benefit and they won't die because these younger people still care about the whole thing, that benefit of the elderly. We think that this is not true because as a principle, because in the world, when you only have a limited amount of resources, you have to spend it either on to benefit the youth or benefit the elderly, right? If they focus all of the materials and when they balance is so much on the side of the youth, then they have to somewhat cut on the elderly to fulfill the youth need and the youth policy that they are trying to push. We think that this is unfair because the elderly is still an important proportion in the population, and just because they have less time on this earth, or just because they cannot enter the market again and make profit to the society again, doesn't mean that they have no value in the society, and doesn't mean that we can just neglect them and moving on to the youth, right? But moving on our third rebuttals on how they say that, oh, these people will care about the elderly because they someday will become the elderly and the policy are long term. We tell you that policy are not that long term, and these people don't have the incentive to care that long 30 years in the futures. We tell you that when this policy only make, for example, one national elections for 4 years or for 5 years, we think that they have no long-term impact in the futures, so that the youth will have the incentive to care about that. But so that boiled down to only one thing left in this debate on side proposition case, is that only this one particular point about political climate change and about how they will solve this problem. We think that as an opposition, we believe that the only problem in the society is not only climate change. We have others problems. We have others vulnerable stakeholders that being affected by this whole policy case. We think that there is still problem, for example, poverty, of healthcare, of other system of infrastructures. And we think that outside of the house can win if we can prove to you two things. First, we to some degree still care about the climate change, but secondly, we also focus and we also fulfill other fields like other social issues that are happening right now. We think that throughout the first speech, we are proven to use two things. The first on how it's principally wrong, and the secondly on how this completely neglect the most vulnerable stakeholder, which is elderly. We believe that this has been clearly explained it to our first speech, and we don't have to explain it to you again. But before moving on, we'll take one POI.
The point of our argument about climate change wasn't the status quo equally weighted climate change right now. It is that an issue that could literally cause the death of millions of people should probably have priority in conversation. But given that a lot of people in the status quo don't care because they don't see their lives impacted, that's where you don't get the impact. You don't see the status quo that is truly justified.
Now, two things. First thing, that we believe that there's still amount of youth now vote for the problems of climate change, right? There's still a proportion, even if that the youth or even if that's elderly people, they still care about the problem of environment and climate change. But secondly, we tell you that that climate change is not the only thing in this society that kills people. There are also other problems that are totally neglected about. We never heard them say a line about how the policy also have an impact on others things in the society. For example, like poverty, they don't care about the elderly people who have no chance of re-entering the market, who will be homeless if we don't care about them, if we neglected them, right? But moving on, we also, on our third substantive, we'll prove to you that how this also harm the youth, because the only thing the youth care about is not environment. Will you sub point 1 on how this impact on the job and employment of the youth? Because if the elderly feel uncertain about the futures, for example, like they see too low pension, they're scared to give up their positions in the market, they will lead to reluctant to retire and they will stick to their job. We think that if the elderly refuse to exist the market themselves, then the youth cannot enter. We believe that the elderly people are also the people who have higher position in the company, who are the executive, and they cannot be kicked out of the company unless they choose to do so, which means, generally said, if you don't protect the right of the elderly, then you also harm the youth as well. But secondly, on certain area of the countries such as Florida or South Korea, where very heavy concentration of elderly residents, the motion disadvantage such community to the extent that national policy are likely to neglect such area given the lower number of votes, which mean the areas still have youth now will be disenfranchised. We think that this policy is double-edged sword to the youth that they wanted to empower. So proud to oppose.
I thank the second speaker of side opposition for their speech, and now welcome the third speaker of side proposition. Here.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? And I would prefer audible POIs. The largest reason why opposition lost this debate is because they never addressed the nuance in the argumentation. Yes, we agreed that democracy is important, that everybody deserves an equal vote. But the problem is when some issues affect more people more than other people, you should give more people weight in that vote because it affects their lives more. That's the principle of democracy. They should have control over how government policies affect your body and your lives in the future. That's why we're very proud to propose. 3 questions I'm going to talk about in this debate. The first is on the principle, whether its policy is morally just. Second, on whether or not we get better policy. And third, and finally, how do we get better engagement with the politics? First, on the principle. The principle they gave you is that everyone deserves the right to vote because they contributed to the government and thus deserve control over government policy. It's a matter of democracy. And we generally agree with that. That's why we give old people the right to vote in state and local elections and still some form of vote in national elections. But the major problem with the principle and all their argumentation down the bench is that they never address what Cameron told you from the one, in which there's exceptions to this equal right if you were more affected. And it's too late for opposition bloc to do so. There are 2 reasons why we told you this is true. First, in terms of long-term issues, we should give more weight to people particularly affected by certain policies. For example, we gave you the example of councils talking about policing. We would give more weight to minority community voices as they're the ones most particularly impacted by police brutality. And second, we also in discussions about abortion, women should have more representation than males because males don't face these issues. The reason why this applies to this debate is because national policy is more about long-term issues, right? It's only when you get so. In state and local elections, you're likely to talk about property taxes or certain short-term issues. But national policy is about climate change. It's about geopolitical security. It's about what happens in the long term in the run of the country. That's why we should give more weight to young people, because they're statistically more likely to live longer. They're more likely to live more decades in which this policy actually comes to fruition and is going to affect their lives. Second, we told you about the balancing act. And this is the second warrant of the first argument that Cameron gave you and Abby extended. Even if you don't believe that warrant before, we told you about the structural shutting out of young people currently in politics. That's to say, right now is in the establishment, the leaders of the political parties and the media leaders are intrinsically old because they have more experience and expertise. Even further, politicians pander to the elderly because they are the ones that hold the most wealth as the young people are just entering in the job market. So in order to get donors in the 2020 election, a lot of people pandered to old people in order to get millions of dollars in donations. The reason why this is important is because even if you believe you shouldn't have positive discrimination, population recognize that our policy is simply balancing the field. Because the fact is, the reason why you don't have youth engagement is because the narrative set at the top, because it is a top to bottom societal narrative in politics, is being set by older people, and we're simply balancing the field for the younger people, and that they're able to get more representation in democracies. This is why our policy is morally just. The second question I'm going to talk about is on policy. And the main argument they brought you down the bench was that older people need to get Medicare and Social Security, they need elderly assistance, and thus we should give them more representation. There's 4 reasons why we win this clash. First, recognize that we're likely to get the impacts on our side as well, because youth literally see their parents and empathize with them. This is because the type of policies you talk about are intrinsically short-term. So the fact is, you need Social Security to put food on the table, you need Medicare to have healthcare insurance. Therefore, if your parents are like starving, you're likely going to support these policies simply because they're affected in the short term. The reason why the reverse isn't true, that older individuals are less likely to focus on youth long-term issues, is because there's a disconnect in that they'll never feel it personally. So the fact is, young people will get older, but older people will never get younger. It's not their fault too, right? We're saying if we're in their shoes, we would feel the same. We wouldn't care as much about climate change because we don't see the personal disconnect. Second, also recognize that the youth care because they're going to get older, right? They still want their elderly benefits when they're older, and so they're going to vote for these issues. Third, I'm going to attack the second argument that opposition gave you, because retirement funds are intrinsically popular among young voters and every voter. There's a reason why generally elderly assistance is a bipartisan issue, even in polarized nations by the United States, right? These are vulnerable people. And attacking the arguments on how there's like, oh, there's a zero-sum game of resources. The fact of the matter is, it's not between choosing, are we going to address climate change or are we going to help elderly? There's a huge lump sum of money in that you can get from increased taxes or taking from the defense budget, right? It's not just a simplistic zero-sum game. Fourth and finally, if we prove to you that the youth will support progressive policies, that means we actually get better assistance for the elderly because you get more welfare and more larger government intervention, like more food stamps and Social Security, etc. We do realize that they may win the impact that they get marginally more policy because the elderly do have more voting, but also recognize that we do mitigate a large amount of their impacts, and their lives aren't going to be miserable because the status quo is going to remain the same for the elderly. They're still going to get their assistance. Let me then weigh this marginal increase in elderly support with youth issues that older people do not support. And I want to first address the shift we heard in the last speech. They told you that older people will still support some climate change and progressive issues, and that is so more important because we'll never get elderly issues on our side. The first thing we told you is why elderly people won't support climate change is because of the disconnect. And the reason for this, and we don't even have to explain it to a vacuum, this is just factually true. You see this right now in terms of like the Brexit vote, where the elderly population led to the Brexit vote actually happening. And the reason why older people are just less likely to believe in climate change because they grew up in a different time where climate change wasn't an issue, and also they feel personal disconnects because scientists are saying this is going to happen 50 years from now when they're dead, and so they would just support less taxes and not actually addressing climate change. Second, we told you that youth are going to address more progressive issues. Why? Because as time goes on, and this is an empirical fact, times change, people are more open to change, and as more integration happens, you see a more you see identities coming together and recognizing that people have human rights. This is why when you see like throughout time periods, you get more advocacy and you get more change, usually coming from the youth. With all the examples Cameron gave you about the Velvet Revolution, the Vietnam War protests, the Civil Rights Movement, all of this comes from the youth, particularly because they support more progressive issues. The fact is, older people are less likely to support social issues because they were born in a time and a place that was far different from the status quo, and thus they're more likely to stay in that mindset. So let's do some weighing here, because first, in terms of long-term issues, and this is particularly true in climate change, it will quite literally lead to the destruction of the environment. You're going to see extreme heat waves and extreme weather. You're going to see cities going underwater and biodiversity and productivity dropping. Climate change has a massive impact in the round that opposition can't ignore. It's going to affect future generations for decades and severely affect their lives and lead to thousands of deaths. Second, we told you about social issues, and these revolve around people's rights. Your right to love who you want, to keep your identity, and to reduce violent issues like police brutality. This is incredibly important because minorities are oftentimes the most vulnerable and the most oppressed in society. The fact is, we get better policy on our side in terms of social issues and helping minorities because the youth are more progressive, as we told you. The final thing I want to talk about is the third argument that Abby gave you on politics in the future. And this is an extension of all the impacts I just gave you on more progressive policy. Because if you have more votes for young people, you get more young politicians in actual leadership positions. This looks like AOC in the United States. When you see a youth wave of turnout, as you saw in the 2020 elections, you get more young politicians who advocate for better issues. And if you increase their vote, people are more likely to turn out and people are more likely to be engaged in politics, meaning that you access all the impacts I told to you about in the second clash. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to be proposing.
I thank the third speaker of side proposition and welcome the whip speaker of side opposition. Hear, hear.
Can I be heard? Can I be heard? Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll start my speech. Sorry. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think proposition loses this debate when all they want to talk about now at third is reduced to simply like climate change and these kinds of discussions. Because really, panel, we told you this debate was about political issues where there are shared resources, for example, social assistance funds that could go to, for example, college debt wives versus going to nursery homes. We told you there needed to be a political balance given that the allocation of resources in politics can benefit elderly individuals, can benefit youth. But the fact is, at a point at which they decide to exclude elderly individuals, that is when they swing the balance of politics in the wrong direction on the principle. I'm going to ask 2 questions in this debate as to why opposition wins both. First, is this politically fair? And then second, does this get the outcomes that proposition talks about? So first, in terms of fairness, right? They never gave you a justification as to why we ought to sacrifice the elderly. And the reason why I bring this up is their analysis on simply they live less is not enough. The reason why is from Zahan, we told you very clearly what it means to be an elderly individual, to be in physical ailment. If it means, for example, that the government who now prioritizes the youth decide to cut your social assistance fund so that it can go towards, for example, a college debt, like we've seen that has been proposed, this means that you're likely to be, live on less. If it literally saw in my home country of South Korea, this means that elderly individuals are more likely then to become homeless. We told you these are real impacts. They never weighed it against these actual impacts that Zahan very explicitly told you about, but rather just like a consideration of whatever, they're not going to live that long. This failure of engagements means they've neglected one of the most vulnerable, as second speaker from Prop rightly says. But I want to get into more engagement on this. I want to talk about long term. So they say like some policies, like policies on the national level have long-term impact. Yeah, of course they have like long-term impact. They're the law. But the thing is they also have short-term impact that are very immediate. As soon as they are enacted, that they affect people. We told you about things like retirement age. The fact that, for example, if you raise the retirement age, my grandfather can't retire with a pension until he works for more years. The fact, for example, if you cut pensions, my grandmother, who was a social servant, now doesn't have those pensions because they go to youth policy. Zahan already gave you the groundwork. Tui already gave you more groundwork on why this is likely to happen. But the real reason why this is so fatal to proposition is they never engage with this reality. They simply just don't weigh it out. But I also want to ask a couple questions on political leans, because throughout this debate, I think it's just assumed on proposition that progressive policy is somehow good. I mean, like, other than hiding behind the issue of like, oh, climate change is going to put our world on fire, they never justify things like why a whole host of other progressive policies that are likely to also follow, for example, things like, college debt wipes, or for example, vast increase in social security that Zahan told you should at least be considered with individuals such as the elderly who are more likely to have to pay into these things. But also, we told you, if there is an unbalance in the political system, that is to say there's some kind of structural exclusion, which doesn't seem to be voter turnout, by the way, we don't understand why you have to unbalance it onto the other side, where you get a lot of the ugly impacts that we told you about. The only thing they said here was that this affects the youth more. And other than on climate change, let's look at a couple of things that we told you. We told you why you have to make trade-offs and resources. It was simply not true that, for example, that if you take pension funds and put it if you take funds out of nursing homes and you put it into, for example, college debt wise, why does this necessarily mean that youth are more affected?
What?
We told you there are a wider range of issues than climate change. I'll engage with climate change later on. But I also want to talk about it's important that in a democracy that every individual is counted the same. This is the reason why democracy is able to defend from amounts of marginalization. I also want to talk about climate change because I think Zahan gave you pretty good analysis as to why climate change isn't as much a political thing as, sure, if it's a crisis, this is much more about scientific denial, scientific acceptance. This is not about trying to get more youths who are voting into this thing. I also want to tell you why their policy, why they try to justify their policies by saying youths are more likely to vote progressive. That's why we're going to support them and give them more votes. This is outcome based. Panel, it was very clear in Zahan's speech that we told them that their burden was simply on the basis that these individuals are youth. That is why they needed the vote, not because they're more likely to support progressive outcome. At a point at which all their benefits, all their towards their justification accrue only when youth will vote progressive, they themselves admit this is a generalization. That means their justification isn't solid. I also want to point out a contradiction in Proposition 3. So Proposition 1 talks about how there's a lot of voter exclusion of the youth, how youth have been locked out from the vote. But then Proposition 3 claims, it tells us that, for example, in the rise of AOC, for example, there was lots of youth turnouts. So I don't exactly understand what solidly the problem is on Proposition. What did this clash give you? For one, we told you why this is going to harm elderly to an extent that Proposition never engaged with. But on a second level, they never engaged. We told you why they never gave a full justification to the extent that their justification relied on practical assumptions that I'll prove that I'll disprove in my second clash on efficacy. Before I do so, go ahead.
Your policy literally likes progressive policies, as all of them give the services you need for the elderly. Given that we told you very specific reasons why the elderly are less likely to support them, given their traditions and they're set in them when society changes around them, we get your policies on our side.
Okay, if progressive policies are so popular, as in literally benefits will accrue for the elderly, we don't understand why they're not voted in. And it's simply not true that the elderly are uninformed and they're so traditional that they're not willing to accept these things. These individuals are also individuals who are able to, be informed voters. I mean, after all, they are individuals who have, as you said, participated longer in the election process. There was never explanation as to why. This is an assumption that somehow elderly individuals just will not ever do progressive policy because they're traditional. Second, on efficacy, and here this is where the vast majority of their flaws lie. So the first thing on long-term policy is that we already told you why short-termist political thinking is not just coming from elderly individuals. It comes from 4 or 5 year term presidents who have no incentive to lay long-term groundwork at a point at which they can benefit from the short-term impacts of their policies right now. For example, President Moon in South Korea made immediate advances in the economy that made long-term harms to, for example, pension funds so that he could be credited with an increase in jobs. But second, we also told you that laws that are progressive we also told you, for example, things like retirement ages, as I've told about before, have very much long-term effects, just like on their side. But I also want to question their characterization here. Are people short-termists or are people long-termists? Because this flip-flops so many times on Proposition. Because the question is, if people are short-termists, they never tell you why youths are more likely to then somehow have long-term thinking in comparison to elderly. But if people are generally long-termists, they never told you why the elderly are going to be so harsh to the environment. That is to say that they're not going to consider the youth that are going to have to live in the future that they create. This flip-flop of comparison was the only thing they say here is people will live longer, but they told you that the empathy exists. And the third speaker tries to get out of this by saying elderly individuals, they'll never become younger. But guess what? They've experienced being young. They often have individuals who have to go through these individuals. But the last thing I want to talk about is will elderly individuals on their side of the house have some amount of vote influence? If it is true that they will still have some amount of political capital, I don't understand at a point at which they characterize them as being politically uncooperative, why any change will accrue on their side. But if it is true that youth will have so much more power, they can overpower these uncooperative elderly individuals, we say this is exclusion, and they themselves will admit that this is undemocratic. But I also want to question on on the last term is they try to co-opt our benefits by saying, oh, don't worry, progressive policies will be more on the youth and they'll benefit the elderly. We already questioned this. Why won't the elderly just vote for benefits that benefit themselves? Just a labeling of traditional progressive doesn't get them that analysis panel. I am proud to stand on a side that one balances the democracy, but second is more likely to get you actual efficacy.
Thank the whip speaker of side opposition and welcome the reply speaker of side opposition. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Panel, I think proposition loses a debate at which their case is really, really inconsistent from the very first start of the speech to P3. Their characterization constantly flip-flops between characterizing how youth voters are structurally left out of the system and then somehow like these people can become youth activists. We think not only is their case inconsistent, but they are also feel a lot of their burdens that I will tackle about this in my two clashes. The first on democracy and fairness, but the second on which side passes better policies. So the first, what do they tell? What is their only mechanism on prop? The only thing they talk about is long-term issues. The example that they really like is climate change. That if something affects your life more, you have more weight. Look, this whole line of logic just doesn't work because I think the magnitude in which something affects your lives more is just subjective. Like, why doesn't national policies about cutting pensions and literally cutting healthcare costs for the elderly don't affect their lives as much as climate change does for the youth? That in itself often means that they cannot claim that somehow a group's worth is so much better than another. But even if we accept that their logic works, here's why. Even if we grant them the best case scenario, why like our worst case scenario is so much worse on their house. We really characterize to you in the very first start of our speech why we think without this kind of intervention, these elderly people will lead miserable lives. This means that as a person that contributed for like literally 50 years of your life, when you're now weakened, where now you're dependent and trust the government to care for you, now you have more weight on the youth voters, which drains out resources and social security funds towards these things like affordable housing or pensions. The worst case scenario on ours in a house is where people become homeless, people become full to social safety nets, or even death. The impact and the worst case scenario that can happen on proposition is maybe like really unguaranteed long-term harms of climate change, or of like really intangible and shallow values of which. But secondly, we also talk to you about how their worst case scenario can be mitigatory, because the counterfactual panel note is that in our world is not a world in which youth are structurally left out. It's a world where we say youth still has a voice, but their words cannot trump, or we cannot compensate a person's vote more than the other. This means that at least we still have change on ours at house, because people can still vote for what they believe in. The problem is they never justify to us why the benefits of adding more weight, like 1.5 weight to the elderly, to the youth votes, outweigh the harm of structurally leaving out and excluding the most vulnerable groups in society. The second class then about passing better policies. I think not only is their characterization really inconsistent, but even if they can somehow prove that there are more progressive policies just by putting in more weight, they already lose this weight, because the comparative is I can still have policies towards climate change. All of our impacts about state reciprocal obligation, without which elderly will lead miserable lives, go unresponded to. But this idea of progressive policies and how long-term effects, right? And then this is here that where they try to co-opt their benefits. But I think that if we have youth votes for policies, this will benefit elderly as well. This is not only a concession with 90% of our case, that elderly issues should also matter as well. But I think if they have the same goals as us, I think they already lose in the debate because their indirect way of giving the vote through the youth and depend on them to benefit the elderly is so much more inefficient and so much more harmful than directly giving these elderly people the vote themselves. But note that they never respond to the argument about how their policy also directly harms the youth as well, in terms of jobs, in terms of unemployment, in terms of vote demographics. For all these reasons, not only do we prove to you why we achieve fairness, democracy, we prove to you why we get solvency on our house. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition reply and welcome the final speaker of the debate, the reply speaker of side proposition.
Wait, can everybody hear me? I think the most crucial piece of characterization that side opposition refuses to engage with is the fact that the elderly don't have representation right now, is the fact that the most vulnerable of like sickly individuals who are poor with no money, no power, no say, in which their only vehicle is a vote, are better helped on our side of the house. Because if you look at the debate, both sides are supporting progressive policy change, right? Presumably on their side of the house, their money for elderly comes from the left because the left is more willing to give social benefits. That's the same party that's willing to support things like climate change. That's the same party that the youth are going to vote for on our side of the house. So we're the ones that actually get popular support for these type of programs in the first place. They never respond to this. The only thing we hear then is that there's a finite amount of resources. So, me as a college student, I have to pick my student loans over perhaps giving poor people and rich and like old people their Medicare and such. Note that this is just untrue, and Miles already tells you about this in his speech. We told you that the left is inherently more likely to vote more resources into the sector in the very first place. That means the cost that is spent and the expenditures that the government is willing to make to social services are far expanded on our side of the house, which means that we're more likely to account for all demographic, which means that college students don't have to make a direct trade-off between perhaps their college loans and giving these older individuals their Medicaid, their Medicare. But note, even in our worst case scenario, let's say that perhaps in Korea, people have to work a bit longer, perhaps older individuals don't have as much pension, etc. Note that on our side of the house, any of the impacts we access are far larger than theirs, insofar as they don't tell us how they actually combat things like racial justice as well as climate change, right? Note that we get no counterfactual or comparative as to how they're supposed to reform their system. I would still like to draw attention to the fact that down the bench, they tell us the society is ailing, there is a problem, but our side is in the way to fix it. And the entire time, they just don't tell us what they're going to do. So we can only assume that they're defending the status quo, a place in which climate change is not being addressed, a place in which elderly individuals that they so desperately want to protect are still not being protected. On our side house, we get those benefits. But now onto the principle. Note that in our side house, there's no tension with the principle, right? We'd say that on our side house, when people are impacted more, that's a justification for why they should get more say, just like how women should get more say in their reproductive rights. We told you that we don't have to prove to you every single member of the youth will have to vote left, but we gave you reasons why they're more likely to do so because of the environment they grew up with. This is not in tension with the fact that they have less political power, because political power and social power are vastly different things. Even though in the United States you got a turnout because of AOC and you got a turnout because of these shifting narratives, does not mean that the rich individuals who are able to lobby, the rich individuals who are able to donate to the Republican Party don't have power anymore. Sure, the youth may control the narrative and they're overrepresented in progressive narratives, but this does not mean in actuality that parties actually care about the youth insofar as they are winning elections like Donald Trump was by pandering to these individuals who cared about tax cuts, etc. So we'd say that the rich have an incentive to continue to pander, and these politicians will never really care about the youth unless they have more votes and another incentive. So really, we're just balancing the scales out of an already unjust system, which they do nothing about. But lastly, very quickly on our benefits about progressive policy, which is exactly what side opposition loses on in the entire debate. Note that if we concede all of their harms, I just don't think elderly people are going to be treated very, very badly on our side of the house. As we already explained to you, that the parties that the youth are voting for are likely to be in support of Medicaid, and there isn't a finite amount of resources because they're opening to investing far more money, diverting from taxes, diverting from the military, etc. That's simply not a problem. On our side of the house, we're able to better tackle things like climate change, and we think it's not unreasonable to say that racial justice and climate change are some of the biggest impacts in the round. We're willing to bite the bullet that even if on our side of the house, poor people and elderly, that the only stakeholder that they want to focus on might suffer a bit more in our worst case. What's good is that we protect the next 30 years from literal extinction, something that they never address. Proud to stand on side proposition.
I thank the reply speaker of side opposition and all of the speakers in the debate for what was an extremely engaging debate. The judges will now retreat to deliberate. The procedure is the same as in the preliminary rounds, so please stay here and wait for the decision and the OA.
Good debate, y'all.